Thank you for joining us once again for favorite day of the week, Peikoff Fridays with James
Woo!
Stevens Valliant. I'm Robert Nasir, joined with Amy Nasir. We're here to talk about James, and this week he has got a killer list of questions from the book that we have been working on now for a few weeks. There's so much good stuff in this. I don't think we'll ever run out. We could do a whole new show based on Leonard Peikoff's answers, bringing ideas down to earth from the book, Keeping It Real. James, how are you doing this fine Friday?
I am doing particularly well today. I am feeling all better from my recent illness. I hope you're feeling well enough as well as possible, given your situation with COVID, but I'm feeling fantastic.
Excellent. Yes, and I'm in the waning days of the COVID empire. I'm feeling pretty darn good, all things considered. Now, you originally scheduled this episode to take place a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And that day it turned out to be the judgment on Roe versus Wade. We've talked a lot about that.
Yeah.
Since then, Amy and I have been to OCON, and there were some more good discussions about that. Reasons to be concerned and reasons to be hopeful. But the topic is religion.
Yes.
Big
religion.
mistake. Now, of course, a controversial title, but there's a whole section in the book, Keeping It Real, on religion, and with good reasons. People brought great questions to Dr. Peikoff, and of course, he has his great insightful answers. When we announced this topic on the social networks, on Facebook, I know that right away the response was interesting, challenging. One of the first questions out the gate, somebody claimed that, well, religion and philosophy are synonyms. It's only when you're trying to use logical fallacies to dismiss philosophies contrary to your own that you limit the definition of the word religion. Now, I would hate to be accused of evading answering a charge like that. You, of course, on the social networks, on Facebook, did a great job. Would it be rude to say taking this guy down? But no. It is a good question when we talk about religion.
Question, yeah, and Peikoff addresses this in a couple of answers here very correctly and well.
Exactly. Now, in the show links, I did put in a link to the Stanford, what's the word I'm looking for now? It just escaped my brain. Stanford University's Index of Philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
If you want, there are 16,000 words on the question of what is religion. But I liked the section where they discussed Hubert, and he brought it down to 5 elements. And the very first element is belief in a deity. I don't think you can call it religion if there's not a belief in some transcendent entity, whether you're using God or something a little more woo than that.
It's got to be a supernatural dimension to it. When someone says that religion and philosophy are synonymous, what they're saying is that faith and mysticism are inescapable. They're saying there's no such thing as a perfectly rational philosophy possible. And that, of course, is false. They're simply denying the possibility of a solidly, purely rational philosophy. That's the assumption. But the distinction is important. And for those of us who do believe that one can construct a philosophy with using nothing but reason, for us, that's the critical distinction. It's one of methodology and one of metaphysics. The methodology is the supremacy of reason, and that it is sufficient and our only means of knowing something beyond the perceptual, and it is fully competent to know. The other is the metaphysical aspect. And if it doesn't involve some belief in the supernatural, something that transcends the rationally accessible, something that transcends things that can be reduced to facts that we can observe, then it is religion. But all religion has one thing in common: a belief in the supernatural and a belief that mysticism, something other than reason, is necessary to acquire knowledge.
Exactly. And two things that are wholly alien to anybody of common sense, but explicitly of objectivism. So yes, I thought your answers to him were good. I think those two are definitional, at least for the purposes of our conversation. And I don't think anybody's in a better position to have given us that than the man who co-wrote the book, Creating Christ.
Yeah, Ayn Rand does actually, I don't know if it's really a definition, but she says in her Playboy interview, she says, you must remember that religion is an early form of philosophy that first attempts to explain the universe, to give a coherent frame of reference to man's life and a code of moral values. And were made by religion before, and that, those assertions were made before men graduated or developed enough to have philosophy. So, and Leonard Peikoff, just to give people some context, describes that as before the Greek civilization.
Well, before the Greeks didn't have a self-conscious understanding of the method of knowing. If an idea pops into my head, ghost, elf, unicorn, that does not oblige reality to contain ghosts, elves, or unicorns. I have to connect the idea in my head to the facts of reality by a specific objective method, a method of reducing my idea to the facts of reality by means of logic and objective concepts. It is absolutely crucial. But before the Greeks, we had no concept of an objective method. There was we used logic in an unself-conscious way to figure things out, but we didn't know what we were doing. We were speaking prose without knowing it. The Greeks began to understand logic and the need for an objective methodology. Human beings also need philosophy. We are tabula rasa in the content of our brains. Everything we know, we learn. And for human beings, we have to even learn the causes, the fundamental reasons for our ethical behavior, for why we act as we do and why we believe as we do. Philosophy is an inescapable necessity for a human being, even before we had an understanding of objective methodology and how we can really get at the truth, in a systematic way. So yeah, philosophy is the broader concept. Humans need philosophy because they are, in effect, born tabula rasa and need to learn everything. We need a philosophy to ground our ethics and our values, our understanding of objectivity. That is an inescapable need, but one that wasn't really understood until the Greeks.
And that gives us perfect jumping off point for the first question you've selected for today, in which the questioner asks Dr. Peikoff, have you ever met anyone who describes himself as both an objectivist and religious? Now, before we get to Leonard's answer, it's funny that I don't know how far back this question was asked, but having been involved in objectivism for, what is it now, 40 years? That can't be right.
35.
30 years, however many years. How many times, and
My goodness,
especially,
you guys are only 35, so how could you possibly
that's
get
true.
objectivism that long?
We were not tabula rasa. We were born with this knowledge.
and especially with the internet, how many times have we faced this question of, oh, well, I'm an objectivist, but I still believe in God. And I don't see any problem with that.
Yeah. Well, it's like that billionaire who offered Ayn Rand $1 million if she could only add a religious element. I love your politics. I love so much of what you say.
I want to help you spread this.
Add religion. And she knew it would destroy the base of all the rest of what she was saying.
And she didn't take the $1 million. What a surprise.
What a surprise. She said, what good would it do me?
Right?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Dr. Peikoff answers, yes, I have. No surprise there. Very many times, but such people are wrong. Religion is, and here we go to your concise answer for the question what religion is. Religion is a form of supernaturalism and faith. It is a diametric opposite of a philosophy for this world, one which upholds secularism and reason. You can't combine them in any way or form. Religion does not mean philosophy. Is our answer to our friend earlier. It doesn't mean a view of life or of values. It's a very specific view. And then he talks about the story about Howard Rourke is answering the charge. You're a very religious man, aren't you? I see that in your buildings. And Howard Rourke, yeah, that's true. But he makes clear, as Ayn Rand did in the introduction to the 25th anniversary of the Fountainhead,
Yes.
that was.
He thought it was, since she got responses, she'd made Rourke's atheism in the novel clear in a couple of places. Yes. Peter Keating explicitly tells Ellsworth Dewey, Rourke, I've known since childhood, and he doesn't believe in God. Yeah. And so we're told he's an atheist, flat out. And it's implied in more than one place. Yeah. But then there's Hopton Stoddard, who commissions the temple. And he tells it, you are a profoundly religious man, Howard. And Howard agrees with him. But of course, that relates to what Ayn Rand was saying in her introduction. It's this commitment to values. It's the taking back of concepts that religion has had a monopoly on, important moral concepts, back to their proper earthly, secular referent that she's talking about. It's Howard's commitment to the sacred, to the sanctity of his work and his life. That's what makes him religious, and that's all Ayn Rand meant there. But she did say in the introduction, I may not have said it that way if I'd known people would have interpreted it that way.
Right.
So
It's interesting because you're right, you give the example. And the other example that comes to mind, Rourke meets his architectural hero, Henry Cameron, who's being all gruff with him. He sees this great talent and he's worried that if he comes work for him, he'll be torn apart. And Cameron's like, when did you decide you wanted to be an architect? And Rourke's like, I was 10. And Cameron dismisses it. Nobody knows what they want when they're, why did you want to be an architect? And Rourke's answer is, well, it's because I don't believe in God. And Cameron's like, what are you talking about? And he says, well, I saw the way that things were and I wanted them to be better. And so there are so many examples of Rourke's atheism that, it wasn't Ayn Rand's mistake. It's more like our questioner from earlier today. He's bringing into the conversation what he wants. People were bringing into the fountainhead what they wanted to believe. Incidentally, when somebody tells me, all philosophies require faith, you can't just be grounded in reason, I'm inclined to believe, at least in that guy's philosophy, his philosophy is not grounded in reason. It is grounded in faith.
Faith has no meaning except in contrast to reason. If there was no objective method of knowing, we couldn't have this non-defined, non-objective method. Well, you need something else, feelings, revelation, Ouija boards, crystal balls, the Oracle of Delphi, tea leaves, whatever they are. These pseudo methods of knowing. Notice they also, all these mystics have these pseudo methods of knowing, whether it is faith, revelation, ancient text, crystal balls, horoscopes, tea leaves, Ouija boards, whatever their pseudo method is, it does not causally connect us to reality in the way I was talking about before, right? Connecting our ideas to reality. It does not, but it is the acknowledgement by mystics that they're skipping the law of cause and effect when it comes to knowledge. There's no magical knowledge. There's no automatic knowledge. And yet that is exactly what faith is asserting. If there weren't an objective means of knowing, see, I know how my senses connect me with reality, and I know how logic keeps me connected to reality. I can demonstrate that, at least validate it in its basics, and then demonstrate it with the higher up parts of it. But they're absent an objective method like reason. All these other methods, these methods of faith, lose meaning. So to say that we have faith in reason is to obliterate the meaning of the concepts, to obliterate the distinction.
Yeah, and going back to, I'd like to go back to, if you allow me a minute here.
Please.
I put together questions that you can ask your friends who admire Ayn Rand, who also say that they're religious. Because, and this is serious. I mean, this is what you can ask them. You can ask them in general, what part of Christianity do you agree with? What do you find philosophically or psychologically helpful about religion? What are your religious beliefs? And then you can list, is it original sin, immaculate conception, personhood at conception, turning the other cheek, maybe the meek will inherit the earth, heaven and hell, disembodied souls, confession to priests, communion with wafers and wine, self-sacrifice, converting your friends so they don't go to hell, considering the 10 Commandments to be a serious moral code, taking the Bible literally, including the Old Testament, and maybe Jesus's ascension into heaven, etc. And then you just go down the list of crazy talk, and then you can say, do you see if that there's a problem with cherry picking the religion? Do you think that you're still a good person in this religion, in the eyes of your God, if you dismiss parts of it? And, then you can get into the morality of it. And you can say, do you think the morality can only be found in religion? I've heard that, by the way, so many times. And then you can say, okay, do you yourself need to be afraid or to have fear imposed on you of religious consequences in order to follow a moral code? Or can you follow a moral code without having fear being the incentive?
Wow.
You have I can put those questions somewhere, but
You do put them in because they're outstanding questions and will draw out how modern, in the contemporary world, they do cherry pick. And they will, it is a cafeteria sort of thing, and they'll just pick whichever bits they want and leave out the other parts they don't like. You're absolutely right. And that fear question at the end may be, that was what got me. I know I was only like 12 years old when this happened, but I thought to myself, the Bible says believe or go to hell, or go to hell if you don't believe. And even as a 12-year-old, I could ask myself, is that the objective way, the proper way of believing something? Should I believe something based on my own judgment, or should I believe something because of guns to my head based on a threat of hell?
Yeah.
And I thought that no benevolent God could even want that. So I said to myself, that's what was the crack actually in the ice for me. And I just thought this whole idea of a threat to get someone to believe something, and that really undermined. When I kept pulling that string, I was an atheist within hours.
For me, it was the idea that yes, there's this threat of hell if you sin, for instance, and then so I asked myself, who is this God? Who is this? I actually read Milton's Paradise Lost in high school, and that helped me figure things out, because it was, and there were other things. There were things in songs, things in other literature that helped me out to say, and reading Nietzsche, of course, how malevolent is this God? And if this God is such a horrible being, a horrible entity, a malevolent entity, I don't want to have anything to do with him.
Certainly the Bible of the God is a malevolent entity who has no problem wiping out innocent children for the sins of their parents and so forth, genocides, universal floods, executions for mere blasphemies, executions for people who don't comply with kosher diet or the Sabbath. I mean, when you speak to modern religious people, whether they're sincere fundamentalist Christians or Orthodox Jews, they'll well, it's a universal, timeless ethics. These absolute ethics that were delivered by God. Well, you don't believe in slavery anymore, do you? You don't think people should be executed for blaspheming, do you? Well, no, of course not. We don't believe that stuff anymore.
Yeah. But are you still a good person in the eyes of your God if you're cherry picking? So
right.
And what got me when I was 15, I became an atheist, and but then I was bolstered by reading Ayn Rand when I was 16 and understanding the idea of existence exists, understanding the idea that if the first cause argument, if God created us, who created God? and then, getting into objectivism, I realized that there's a moral code that's based in the nature of man and reality that I can use to better my life. And so I did.
Ayn Rand took away religion's the last arrow in their quiver. They have long had the monopoly on ethics. And so many of our scientific, modern philosophical friends say there is no way to objectively derive an ought from an is. So they've conceded the point to the religious people, in effect. It's either emotional subjectivism or it's rank mystic intrinsicism. And that's the general view you'll get from both sides. Ayn Rand answered the question. There is an objective ethics for living on Earth, taking away the real emotional power that religion continues to have in our society.
And that's why, jumping to question 2, Leonard Peikoff's answer to this one initially surprised me. The question is, well, would you call religion evil? I know the way it was asked originally in the context of the dim hypothesis, of his hypothesis that history can be best understood by our approach to ideas, and specifically, do we integrate our concepts, or do we accept disintegration, or do we integrate them, i.e. in the concept of religion? The question, would you call religion evil? And Leonard Peikoff says this: well, religion as such, no, because it is a primitive form of philosophy, which I believe could not have been avoided at the beginning of the species. Moreover, as Ayn Rand said, it's earlier than we think. When we see what's going on among the voters in this country, and this was in the mid-2010s, and the scientists who embrace Christian contradictions, that statement is even more applicable. It's earlier than we think. Religion, I would say, is mistaken. It has very bad consequences. If it takes over a culture, it is a disaster. But it is, in my opinion, not as bad as nihilism. The only thing worse about religion is that it can last for centuries, whereas nihilism can't. And then he says, I would say the leaders of the religious movement, the intellectuals, the philosophers, the popes, the hierarchy, those people are definitely evil because they are spreading poison. They have plunged themselves into the ideas of the religion, knowing perfectly well, or able to know, the extent to which they have to evade to promulgate it. But I would not say the ordinary religious person is evil. He's just accepting what he is taught without thinking. Now, that was interesting to me, Leonard, Dr. Peikoff's answer there.
Yeah, really good answer. Religion, before we discovered an objective methodology of knowing, see, we've got to learn everything. We even have to learn how to learn. So before we developed a self-conscious understanding of objective methodology, and that really did begin with the Greeks and their discovery of logic and science and method, before that, it's inevitable that irrational ideas, inconsistent ideas, mystical ideas are going to be there. And as Dr. Peikoff points out there, nihilism has nothing to offer. It cannot be an operative philosophy for very long in someone's life. It really can't. It's sort of self-destructive, annihilating by its own terms. Whereas religion at least says there is a truth. Yes. And religion at least says there are values. There are objective values. There's a right and there's a wrong. And so in that sense, religion is infinitely better. It at least attempts to give a shot at philosophical answers and grounding for our knowledge. Whereas nihilism is the exact opposite. So you gotta agree with him there. And you've also got to agree with him that before the discovery of objective methodology, religion was sort of inevitable. One aspect of this, if I could just point out one little aspect of this, we just assumed thousands of years ago that everything in nature was like us. We didn't appreciate how unique we are as human beings in the nature of our consciousness. And so it was perfectly natural for us to project our consciousness onto everything else. The animals, they don't even need to learn. They don't need to get taught in some instances. They must be much wiser than us people. And of course, the sun, when it gets up in the morning, it must get like me getting out of bed. It leaps out of bed with a purpose. And so the sun gets up with a purpose. So causality for the ancient mind was just like the causality they have about what they do and picking up things and making decisions in their life. They didn't realize there was such a thing as natural, non-consciousness driven, non-purposeful causality. That was a discovery. Science began when they left out the gods from the explanations, when some greater consciousness, the consciousness that we projected onto the whole world, which is really just our consciousness, leave that God out. No, it's a natural phenomenon, a natural process, a natural cause. That was the beginning of science. But it was a refinement in our understanding of cause and effect itself that really was taking part. So in history, it's really that revolutionary. Humans, religion is inevitable, I think, in the course of human development, just by the nature of human consciousness. But it is pernicious in its effect. And I would say that today's religious leaders, those who advocate religion today, after the Enlightenment, after the age of science, those people must necessarily be dishonest. They're like academic Marxists, in my view, evading the last 100 years of blood-soaked nightmares of communism. That's evasion on a scale today, which is not understandable in any sense as intellectually honest. So today's advocates of religion and the hierarchy, obviously they are evil people. They're spreading disaster. And ultimately, truly, one more thought here. Religion is the source of most of the problems in philosophy. It is the source of the intrinsicism that gives rise to methodological, psychoepistemological errors. Ayn Rand, way back in her very first philosophical notes, when she was still in her 20s, she said that religion is what causes people to be able to think that they can live one way and believe another way. And so she identified a very important fact way back there. The mere positing of the supernatural will necessarily divide our consciousness, the real from the ideal. The ideal is in this supernatural realm we could never really attain. It'll therefore have a consequence on theory and practice. Yeah, it may not work here on earth, but we're doing it to get into heaven. So there's a sort of theory practice. Ultimately, it causes a mind-body dichotomy, a war with our own bodies, where you see these ascetics in both Eastern and Western tradition taking vows of poverty and celibacy and starving themselves to death. So yeah, the generation of so many philosophical errors comes from religious thinking. It is the root of so much bad in philosophy that we're still overcoming the Dark Ages. We're still overcoming the habits, the mental habits that we developed when we were religious. That is where objectivism can help stamp out all the remaining lingering aspects of that kind of primitive mentality. So religion is a pernicious effect, no doubt about it, but it was inevitable. And frankly, people need philosophy. So if you're just ordinary rank and file religious person, you could well be a totally honest person who just hasn't given much thought to this. We all do need a philosophy.
What do you think of the idea, James, of the idea, the idea of like primitive people? Say, for instance, the Native Americans. You have the tribes, you have the chieftain, you have the people that, it's always some kind of monarchy or tribal system of, you've got the head, you've got his helpers or his knights or his whatever, and then the priest or the clergy or however. And that kind of setup has been going on for some time and everything. And I think that pre-Greek civilization, you could see that in the pharaohs of Egypt and Sumerians and all this. In terms of it being structured that way, you've got one leader like the pharaoh, for instance, who was also a god.
Right.
So I think, that kind of social structure lends to the idea of a religion.
Exactly. So you pick up Egypt as a great example. Egypt depends upon the annual flow. It's the middle of the Sahara Desert, but it's got this big river, the Nile, flowing through it. So the food, the agriculture that it's so abundant in Egypt, they were the breadbasket of the ancient world. They really were. But it all depended on the flooding of the Nile. And they could predict the flooding of the Nile and when that would happen and so forth. But just as the natural order needs to be kept in order, we got to appease the gods to keep that Nile flooding, so it is that our political order is of the same kind. If we don't get the right pharaoh and the pharaoh isn't obeyed, then we're upsetting the natural order, you see. So in their minds, social organization, they could see the benefits of social organization, cooperative planning, working together. They could see the benefits of that. And that had a sort of a mystical implication to them. One they couldn't understand, and so collectivism was immediately imbued with a mystical element. It's not just gods or the god, when you get to monotheism, but the collective that has mystical status, whether it's the pharaoh, the nation, the tribe, the race, the state, and we have to defer and sacrifice to that element. So all of these things, altruism and collectivism, are natural parts of a mystical worldview. A pre-scientific worldview. Yeah.
So as I'm trying to figure out just how much of this really was necessary, I'm going to jump to question 3, which is related, because the questioner asks, is it rational to say that religion is only evil in a conceptual context, that it was in fact good during the pre-conceptual times, even an inevitable necessity for survival? And interestingly enough, Dr. Peikoff answers no. I would say religion was never good. It was, from the beginning, and will remain to the end, the root of all destruction. But I would classify it as a necessary evil. Necessary because, for the reasons I've said, it was unavoidable prior to the time all the philosophies of objectivity, causality, rationality were discovered. In other words, prior to the Greeks. It's a tremendous achievement even to conceive of the world in secular terms. It took millennia of slow, painstaking growth and observation before the sudden torrential brilliance of the Greeks. Until that time, it just seemed obvious to people that the only explanation of things was that they do something, and that's the explanation. So the tree must do something, or a little spirit of the tree, or a big spirit outside the tree. All these primitive things, as far as I can see, are all that they were able to do on their primitive level. And he goes on a bit, but I guess that's consistent with the way you've been describing that.
He says it more eloquently.
Nothing.
As usual, I learned it from him, and he said it far more eloquently than I could.
But it's interesting to me because I always think, was it really necessary? For example, I think of the ideas of colonialism and imperialism, and I understand that through the lens of spreading Western civilization to cultures that were worse off for their lack. And not just a little worse off and we made things a little better. They were nightmare bad, and Western civilization brought civility and
the difference between the Dark Ages in European history and the previous classical period that came before and the high medieval and Renaissance period that came after is just that, the power of religion. And to the degree a culture takes religion seriously, it will send itself into a dark age. It will. History has shown that again and again. And the difference is the degree of religiosity. As religion went into slow retreat following the Renaissance, and religion in the Western mind has really been in slow retreat since the Renaissance, old religion, that was the beginning of liberation. That's what led to the age of science. That's what led to the discovery of individual rights and the creation of a place like America. It was that revolution in moving away from religious values and the developing of secular scientific values that really made all the great values of our contemporary world possible, truly.
Yeah, and that's a little clarifying for me. I'm still going to have to work on that one myself because I think part of it is I get hung up on parts that I think weren't necessary. So,
well,
for example,
there were parts that weren't really necessary. And we could have, like he says, it's a bad thing. If someone could have intervened in the ancient world and explained things better and had some answers, but he's right. It's sort of inevitable in our state of ignorance that some of this, at least.
Yeah. You can find the exceptions even back in Greek times. There were people who understood no matter what, slavery was wrong, for example. And yet it's all too easy to say, but even in the time of the founding fathers, people didn't really get that. Well, sure, but some of them did. And so I have to wonder a little bit about necessary evils, how much of it was necessary versus how much of it should be judged harshly even. And I'll keep working on it and I'll reread these a couple times.
Let me draw a distinction for you. For the people who saw the destruction of the classical world, even if they didn't understand secular philosophy properly and took us into a dark age, I'm still able to say those are bad people. Those people who took the classical world, the Greco-Roman world, into a mystical, overtly, rankly Neo-Platonic direction, those people were not good, honest people. They knew better because they had a classical Greek civilization to look back on. So I think we can still judge people in certain contexts. Now, if you ask me what about, say, like Thomas Aquinas, a deeply religious man, but what he did was to reintegrate ancient Greek rational philosophy into Christianity, at least as best as he could, and bring Aristotle back into the Western mind. Now, he may have believed in God, he may have tried to prove the existence of God, but in my mind, he was a hero. He was a hero. So the people that brought us into the Dark Ages and the people that brought us out of the Dark Ages, I think can still be regarded as either villains or heroes, respectively. It doesn't change that, Robert. And there are times when the religion is so awful, as in the Dark Ages, and much worse than the period that came before, that I think we can morally judge at least the intellectual leaders of those movements.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, real quick, because we're just past the bottom of the hour, I want to say thank you to our super chatters. Excuse me. First out of the gate was Jeff Bannister. Thank you for that. Very much
Jeff.
Appreciated. Man, I thought I was almost over COVID.
And again, Jeff Bannister for $20.
And then he's in with a question. Yeah, he says, much correlation to earlier pagan ritual culture. Why does all of this get lost to current practitioners.
I'm assuming he's thinking of the Wicca community and pagan communities out there.
Well, I think he's actually.
Or do you think?
I'm guessing he's thinking, why don't people who consider themselves nowadays Christians
for
don't
example,
look back and.
Christianity has some elements that are very alien to Judaism, the religion that it's supposed to be based upon. And one of those elements is, say, the man God Jesus. There's no man gods in Judaism, which is strictly monotheistic. There's God and his angels, but there's there may be great men like Moses and David in Hebrew tradition, but they weren't gods. And so Jesus, a God man, is a wholly pagan idea. It's all over Greek and Roman mythology. It's all over Egyptian mythology, but it's not to be found in the Jewish religion that Christianity claims to be the fulfillment of. And so there were these very pagan ideas that got introduced into Christianity, and modern Christians don't want to admit that. They want to act as though Christianity is unprecedented. But religions that had nothing to do with Jesus Christ had the exact same method, the formula of religion that Christianity does. They would have rituals that would cause the deity to become indwelling in you, a transformative experience where you accept Jesus in effect, or Dionysus, or Orpheus, or Asclepius, or Serapis into your heart, transforms your life. And now, because you accept this deity and whatever his sacrifice and his apotheosis was, they normally were dying, suffering savior gods. They had a horrible death, but then enjoyed an apotheosis and became gods after their death, just like Jesus. And it was that example that proved the model and hope for my afterlife, for all the devotees having a happy afterlife. And that model was common. So when Christians say, well, we get into heaven because of the blood sacrifice of Jesus for all mankind, that's nothing original to Christianity in that at all. It is a pagan thing based on the pagan demigods of the Greco-Roman world. Christians cannot admit such things because, of course, that would admit that the basic structure of their religion is, there's nothing new about it, and it was basically Xeroxed from previous paganism. If that's what your question meant, it's a really good question.
Yes, he says, I confirmed with Jeff that that is correct, yes. And in terms of the other question that I thought, and I misinterpreted as people who are considered pagans in current day times. I don't know.
My wife will jokingly call herself, people will ask my wife, Holly, what her religion is. And she says, I believe in Zeus and Athena. How about you? Yeah. No, of course, it's half a joke. And she just wants to see the response. But it's really a good one, right? One God, not 12 gods.
Yeah, I think I've known some people who are into Wicca and paganism and things like that. It's kind of half-hearted. It's not even really a religion. It's more of like, I don't know, cosplay.
There's another thing about religion that I think is important to note, and it's connected to Ayn Rand's theory of aesthetics. Just as Ayn Rand said that art is a way for us to emotionally experience our highest, most abstract values by rendering a concrete so stylized that it evokes this metaphysical value. And so we have a way of concretely and emotionally experiencing what are really abstract values that transcend the perceptual. It's reducing it to the perceptual so we can emotionally experience it. Yes. This is true, I think, generally for a wider phenomenon of things. Symbol, ceremony, ritual. What we're doing with symbol and ceremony and ritual is something very, very human. Reducing to a concrete ceremony, say, you've graduated from college, your status has changed, and we want to recognize your achievement. We want to put a milestone down and a marker down saying you're different now than you were before, but it's a purely abstract thing. It's a purely abstract thing. So how do we do that? We reduce it to the physical by means of a concrete ceremony or symbol, which can give us the emotional reality of what had been a long-term value. The 4 to 14 years you'd spend at university to get that degree and graduate, now is suddenly reduced to a concrete moment where you receive that diploma, and it may be purely symbolic, but it has an emotional impact, and it has the psychological effect of objectifying that moment. So I would say Ayn Rand's theory of aesthetics gives us great clues into the power of religion and the importance of ceremony, symbol, and ritual in general for human beings.
Yeah, I think of that. I think of the Freemasons, and be an interesting topic to get into at some point. I don't know too much, and who does know exactly too much about the Freemasons? But,
well, my great uncle was a 30-degree Mason or whatever, and I didn't learn anything from him. So.
Well, and
yeah,
it brings
ritual's great.
It
Yeah.
brings to mind the idea of myth and mythos, which on the face of it are simply another word for fiction, except there's a will to believe, to allow these ideas to bleed over into your sense of what's actual in myth that goes far beyond fiction. And in that regard, we jump to question 4 here, which should be real quick, right? Like all of them. Do you think, this is so common too, another one where a very common question, not the answer I expected. Do you think most people embrace religion and mysticism because they seek to escape death? How many times have we heard that before, right? People just want to believe because they don't want to believe, they're going to die someday.
Or there's no atheists in foxholes.
Right.
There's that too.
Yeah.
Right.
And Leonard once again surprises me.
Death, right?
It's not surprising in the way I expected, but he says, no, I don't believe that. They don't want to escape death. They want to escape the requirements of life, specifically self-sufficiency.
Boom, mic drop. That's
Yes,
it.
that's such a good.
It was.
That was interesting to me, though, because my experience of religion in recent years has been upper middle class American religion, which means people who aren't trying to escape responsibilities such as hard work and providing for your family and generally doing the right thing. So in that kind of case, what kind of responsibilities are we talking about? And yet, yes, it's true. On some level, they are escaping a responsibility, a substantial set of responsibilities.
Can I give an example from a personal
Please.
I'm having right now, in fact, with a dear friend of mine who's got a brain tumor, and he's going through some serious health problems. And he has religious relatives, a mother and a sister who are deeply Christian. And right now, he finds it impossible to talk to them about what he's going through, because when he speaks with them, he will say, okay, well, the anesthesiologist has put off the surgery for a week. And mother will respond, well, we want God's timing on this. And he said, no, I want the anesthesiologist's timing on this. It's his efforts that will make the difference. It's my courage and my judgment about these doctors that will make the difference. And what mother does there is wipe out the human effort involved, the human choices involved. There are certain things we have to accept as metaphysical facts. He's in a rough spot, but there are things we can do in the meantime. And it's up to my friend, his courage, his rationality, his attitude right now. And it's up to his doctors, their skill, their education, and making sure that these guys are coordinated about that. The religious person wipes out human effort, wipes out human virtue. It's Jesus's time. And so if the timing works out, it's not the anesthesiologist's good judgment. It's not my friend's endurance and courage. No, it's Jesus who did it for us. It wipes it out. It does not encourage it, reward it, validate it, give it the praise, really, that human virtue deserves. And it ignores the metaphysical, as if it all doesn't work out, well, then God didn't want you for it to work out. Or if it does work out, well, God, you see, gets all the credit. It is not about comforting. It is about not comforting. It's about eliminating human volition and metaphysical fact.
Yeah, in that way, it's nihilistic.
Bingo.
Extraordinary malevolence.
Coin. If you're a consistent mystic, the other side of that mystic coin is nihilism.
Yep,
yes.
Exactly. The other side of the coin.
It could be the level of, well, here, let me read the next question before I get into how malevolent is that, because it's related. Does a reason-based philosophy offer any source of comfort in times of tragedy and distress the way God does? I've never heard someone say, well, I took comfort in my atheism. when coming through an ordeal.
That's true.
Yeah, but what is wrong with that question? How many things are wrong with that question?
Yeah, my disbelief in elves and unicorns never proves comfort to me either.
And the first reaction I had is the first thing that Dr. Peikoff says, which is, first of all, if they're thanking the Judeo-Christian God, then that's pretty fantastic. Now, remember when Leonard Peikoff uses the word fantastic, he means it's fantasy.
Mhm.
He uses that word a lot, but he never means what a lot of us mean by it. He says, no, that's pretty fantastic. Because according to that viewpoint, God is the one who caused the tragedy and the disaster to begin with. That's part of his plan. It's senseless to then say, oh, thank God I have the strength to survive the evil that God himself created. How can you get comfort out of that? It's beyond any rational explanation. And then he says, you don't, according to objectivism, get comfort out of atheism. What you need in that kind of question is a philosophy that will help you understand how to interpret this tragedy in light of a view that reality of values of what's possible to man or what isn't. Some tragedies you cannot be comforted out of. The loss of a child, for instance, or the loss of just the loss of the page I was working on.
See, we can never get comfort from that.
Yes. No philosophy is going to make that a comfort unless it tells you a fantasy that you'll meet them in another dimension. The only way to survive, if it is survivable, is not to say, well, this is the work of a supernatural being, but this is a disease or an accident or a natural cause. It's indifferent to the possibility of life and the fact that we are not omnipotent. If I choose to live, I've got to accept that, grieve, and ultimately go on with my life. That's the only comfort that you can get, a solid philosophy that lets you evaluate and a view of reality as fundamentally benevolent and open to achievement, even though you have just undergone a tragedy. Now, that to me, when I fully understood the benevolent universe premise, the idea that the universe is knowable and dealable with, that logic and reason can allow you to function in the universe. The universe isn't out to do anything for you, but it's not against you. It's simply there and you can rely on it. That to me was the ultimate comfort.
Yes, yes.
That is the ultimate comfort. If I don't face up to the facts, whatever they are, I am making myself, first of all, I'm evading, but second of all, I'm making it impossible for me to actually deal with it and cope with it. Only to the extent that I'm facing the facts as they are, objectively. Now, that may not be pleasant for some people. They may want to live in some fantasy world where, you know, everything is rainbows and lollipops. But until and unless we get real about the facts, there's no way we can cope with them. And like I say, on the other hand, when we can do something about it, to the extent we can do something about it, we're giving the credit to someone else. We're God. And because, of course, the blame also goes to God. But of course, they don't like doing that, except in terms of, well, it was a punishment, you say, or of some kind. But the fact of the matter is, it's like the old Mark Twain joke. Humans suffer for thousands of years from some disease. A doctor works day and night for years to come up with some vaccine or some cure for the disease. He comes up with it, saves thousands of lives. And what do people do? They thank God. Instead of saying, hey, wasn't he the one responsible for the disease that killed people for all those millennia? Shouldn't we be crediting the doctor or the scientist who came up with the cure or the vaccine? Doesn't he get the credit for saving all those lives now? No, it's exactly that gets wiped out. The only real comfort that you can give someone in a time of crisis or a bad situation, or even in an impossible situation, is to face up to reality and either accept the reality that we cannot change or have the courage to do what we can about the things we can.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, the Serenity Prayer, which Ayn Rand has quoted. And to me, again, you know, we can say, well, there's no comfort, but to me, it's the ultimate comfort, both to know that I can act, I can take action, I can build a life, I can make things happen. And also when something bad, something tragic happens to us, to know that is simply the nature of things that happened. There was no malevolent force behind it. Most of life isn't like that, but when it is simply a thing that happened. And as sad as that is, the fact that, for example, we are mortal and our time is finite, there is no malevolence behind it. That to me is the ultimate comfort.
Absolutely. You know, if you took the Serenity Prayer seriously, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, you'd eliminate the need to ever pray again.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. That's right.
It's the prayer that destroys all need for further prayer, right?
Couldn't have said that better. So we'll wrap it up real quick here. Oh, we do have a super chat from Apollo Zeus for £2. He says, "Don't eat me," and has a picture of a pig. Now that needs to be explained. If you're in the chat, and you should always be in the chat, but if you're in the chat, you know, there's a long conversation there about, of course, if there is nothing else that you hold against religion, Judeo-Christian ethics, the prohibition on eating bacon, on eating pork products, right there should have been all the argument you need.
No, God could endorse slavery in the Mosaic law, but he wanted to make sure we didn't eat pork and shellfish.
Yes.
So, you know, God's moral priorities there were really sound, right?
Yes, exactly right. So we wrap up with this question. Somebody asks, Dr. Leonard Peikoff, "I have friends who share my atheism and friends who are devoutly religious. Both share my great value, the pursuit of moral perfection. Is this consistent with objectivism?" without going right to Leonard's answer, James, what do you think? I have friends who are...
It is religion that destroys the objectivity of the concept of perfection. Religion is what tells us that the perfection is impossible. It tells us to be mawkish and appeasing of evil, forgiving. We've got to forgive everything because, after all, we're all just corrupt human beings who can never live up to God's ethics because it has nothing to do with this world. So if you have some Platonic religious view, if you have some ethics from the supernatural that can't be lived up to, then of course perfection is impossible, becomes a mystical concept, and you must end up having contempt for humanity to that degree.
The question is almost unfathomable.
Unfathomable. It is not the concept of perfection that I would cite as something that I could ever share with a religious person, because it is religion that makes an objective concept of perfection impossible. Look, if I'm trying to be consistently rational in all ways, if I'm doing my best, at least in my context, to be as rational and consistent as possible, I am perfect. It's more common than people think it is. And the idea that perfection is somehow out of human reach altogether is a purely religious idea. It is exactly on the concept of moral perfection that there can be really no ground between the mystic and the objectivist. For the objectivist so embraces life on earth that we believe that there's nothing imperfect about it. To do that is to assume that God or someone created the world and could have done it otherwise. The world is what it is. Moral perfection applies only to volitional beings like us, and it only applies to the extent that we have a choice. That means I must be able to be perfect. Otherwise, your concept is meaningless. You're blaming me for things I can't control. It had nothing to do with, like original sin or something, or my emotions.
It's hard to even imagine asking that question. If you know anything about religion, you know what original sin is. If you know what it means to have the kind of pride that aspires to moral perfection, that wants to build a tower to the heavens, and what God would do if you ever tried that. So I won't jump right to the answer, because we had $25 super chat.
That one myself.
Yeah. Well, we have a big super chat. Thank you very much to Richard Cameron.
Thank you, Richard.
You know, the super chats that you put in support the Ayn Rand Center UK, this channel on which we're operating, keep the center going, keep us all fired up as well. So $25 from Richard Cameron with this comment, and I have to read this because I get it. He says, "I grapple with not considering religion inherently evil in today's context, especially the willful ignoring of child abuse within religious communities."
Yeah.
Now, the physical beating or sexual or whatever kind of child abuse we're talking about, obviously and viciously evil, but even just what it does to a sensitive soul to be brought up in that kind of community, that kind of context. James, I think you've got the kind of experiences I had where you're a young kid and you're taking this stuff seriously. They're telling you, okay, well, here's what you've got to do to get to heaven. And it's a list of things none of us are doing or can do. Here's what happens to you if you don't go to heaven. You're telling young children this. How is it?
The terror trauma that these priests inflict, whether they molest kids or not, is bad enough. You're going to hell. And Jesus said, you have heard it said, thou shalt not kill. I tell you, if you feel anger in your heart, you've already sinned. You've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery. I tell you, if you lust in your heart, you've already sinned. What kind of a chance does that give anybody? How can I go through a day without feeling lust or anger? And so we're inherently sinful. There's no way to avoid being sinful. We are corrupt by our very nature. And so these priests, these priests are classic molesting priests are classic examples of what I mean. They are experts. They know that their Christian ethics cannot be lived up to. They know they're inherently sinners. They know that there's some means of divine expiation for whatever crimes they do, including child molest. So since they have a means of confession and forgiveness, and God will forgive anything, and we're all inherently corrupt and we can't live up to the ethics anyway, then yeah, it gives them, in effect, moral excuse as far as I'm concerned, and a moral out for engaging in immoral behavior. So the very moral authorities that Catholic parents ascribe to these priests, they sign their children over to them for instruction in school, and moral instruction in particular. So they're moral authorities, and they're the ones engaged in this. I have to agree with Mr. Cameron here. It is hard to grasp the idea that anyone who understands that and understands that mechanism could be tolerant of what's going on. The Catholic Church has systematically covered up for these monsters. And we're talking thousands of monsters with tens, if not hundreds of thousands and millions of victims over the decades and centuries, I bet. So yeah, it is hard to reconcile that.
And let's include other sects like Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. Lots of child sexual abuse.
Yeah, we've
cases
have friends who've been through that as well.
Yeah. And what they do, the typical molester will terrify his victim anyway. He'll groom his victim, and then he'll say, you can't tell anyone. I prosecuted child molest as a DA for several years, and the pattern is always the same. They will in some way traumatize, threaten, induce fear in their victim. The priest is in a particularly powerful position to do that, and it makes it all the more traumatic. Here is the moral authority doing this to you. Victims of that kind of child abuse are going to be affected for the rest of their life, in my experience as well. So it's a horrific, horrific crime. I really have to say, I tend to agree with Mr. Cameron there strongly.
So back to the question of this person who is claiming that his religious friends are striving for moral perfection.
Yeah.
Leonard Peikoff gets brutal with him. We're coming up on the top of the hour, so I won't read the whole answer, but he ends it with, you could just as well say, I'm going to be friends with a Nazi who strives for moral perfection. There were such. There were girls, for instance, in the Nazi breeding homes who prayed that they would have a great deal of pain when they gave birth so that they could feel and show their passion for the Führer. This is as close as you can get to a perfect Nazi, but that is not what I regard as objectivist basis for friendship. Now, it may seem a little extreme to compare a Nazi's idea of moral perfection with a Christian's ideal of moral perfection, but I think it makes the point that your Christian friends strive for moral perfection. That's not the same thing. It's not just, we've got a few different check marks. It's not the same thing as all as when a rational person says, no, I'm going to be good.
Right. Totally different thing. They're different categories. They're different in kind. Even the attempt to be a perfect Christian, which Christians deny is possible, but even the attempt to be a perfect Christian is going to involve you in immorality. A Christian who is devoted to perfection, or at least striving for perfection as a Christian, to that extent, is going to be doing something rotten. Take, for example, our most perfect Christians, those priests. They're taking vows of celibacy. If they're monks, they're living cloistered lives, vows of silence, self-abnegation, perhaps self-flagellation. That is immoral. That is self-destructive. It is wrong. To achieve Christian perfection in that sense is a bad thing.
Just so. So I think we've made a pretty good case for where objectivism stands on religion. Now there is more to be said. It's a whole section of the book.
Yes.
But given the chat and some of the comments that I see in here, I think that Mr. Valliant, your answers have proved enlightening for us. Obviously, the man who co-wrote Creating Christ would know. Link to that is in the show notes if you haven't bought and read the book yet. If you've ever wondered, and most of us have, well, if this stuff isn't true, this particular religion, although we can spread that more broadly, if Christianity isn't true, where did it come from? Well, fortunately, in 2022, there are answers out there. And James, we thank you so much for being the man with the answers today, the man with the answers to those questions as well. And we look forward to doing this again next week. Thank you to everybody in the chat who's been joining us. Thank you,
Yes.
Amy, for sitting by me so close to me, despite the possibility of COVID infection. But this has been an important discussion for me. Yeah. Again, a few things I'm going to keep working on. I shudder about religion, but Dr. Peikoff makes a good point. It's part of the history of the development of philosophy. You started from nothing. You started from cave drawings. You couldn't get where we are today without intermediate steps.
And I just want to say, yes, this has answered the question, is religion a big mistake? Yes. And I'm going to go ahead and post on my wall and some other places my handy guide to the questions you might ask your religious objectivist friend.
Please do. Excellent. That was great. Yeah. You guys are the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. We look forward to next Friday.
Super chatters. Please do consider supporting Ayn Rand Center UK if you find this content of value at all. It really helps keep the lights on, and you'll get special benefits that are available only to subscribers. This Sunday, for example, we're going to continue our discussion of Leonard Peikoff's Ominous Parallels, and you get to participate in that if you're a subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK. So do consider it.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have an outstanding afternoon, a great weekend. We will see you in a week.
Take care.